I want you to think back to the media coverage of the 2014 Ferguson protests. Just picture what you saw in the news back then.
Right, the tear gas, the crowds, the hashtags.
Exactly. It was this massive global story.
Mm.
But, what if the story that got broadcast to the world was just fundamentally different from what was actually experienced by the people on the ground?
I mean, that's the big question here. Because we're looking at a situation where a local activist stood on the front lines, fought for her community, and then just a short time later, she's having her house broken into. Her bedroom door gets kicked in.
Yeah, she's facing this barrage of threats.
Hmm.
And the really unsettling part here, and this is kind of the crux of what we're talking about today, those threats allegedly weren't coming from the police.
Right.
They weren't coming from the local political establishment. They were coming from inside the very movement that made her city famous.
Which just completely shatters that narrative we all watched unfold on our screens, right? It forces us to look at the mechanics of modern social movements from a much darker, far more cynical angle.
It really does. So that is our mission for this deep dive today. We are unpacking a highly controversial interview from the African Diaspora News Channel.
Yeah.
And it features a woman named Nyota Uhura. So she's a St. Louis activist, an original member of handsup.shoot.com, and somebody who's actually on the ground in Ferguson from hour one.
Which makes her perspective so crucial because it poses this massive question for anyone who cares about how information is shaped, like how does a hyper-local cry for justice transform into this multi-million-dollar international apparatus?
But before we pull all that apart, we do need to put a firm boundary around this discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to be clear about this.
Right, because this source material contains some very politically charged claims. We are dealing with allegations that target well-known nonprofits, highly visible national activists, and political figures on both the left and the right.
It hits everyone. So to be completely clear with you, the listener, we are not taking any sides here.
Not at all.
We are not endorsing these viewpoints. Our sole job today is just to impartially break down the claims made in this interview and examine the underlying logic of Nyota's perspective. We're just analyzing the architecture of her argument.
Exactly. And that argument, it really requires us to go back to the absolute beginning. Because to understand how a movement is supposedly hijacked, you have to understand how it was born.
Right. And in Ferguson, it didn't start in boardroom. It definitely didn't start with some polished social media rollout.
No, not at all. According to Nyota, it started with this profound, just agonizing local indignity. Because the catalyst wasn't just the tragic fact that Michael Brown was killed.
Right, it was the aftermath.
Yeah, the flashpoint was that his body was left lying in the summer heat, literally in the middle of the street, for 4 hours. Nyota notes in the interview, and this is a quote, "They don't even do that for dogs."
Which is just, it's devastating. But that specific detail, that is the emotional engine of the entire initial uprising.
Yeah.
Because in those early hours, there were no designated leaders. There was no overarching strategy or branding. Nyota describes heading down to the Ferguson Police Department and finding maybe 50 local people there.
Just 50 people.
Right, just a small local group. And out of that raw collective grief, they formed the Justice for Michael Brown Leadership Coalition.
Wow.
And it was organically diverse, elders, youth, straight men, single mothers, all operating as this unified local front demanding answers from their local government.
And that paints a picture of a very traditional grassroots civic action. But we know the timeline almost immediately fractures into chaos, right?
It does, yeah.
Because within days, we see the burning of the local Quick Trip convenience store. And, I have to push back on the strategy here a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
Because if the goal of a community is to hold a corrupt municipal government accountable, destroying your own local infrastructure just seems entirely counterproductive.
Right, it looks terrible from the outside.
Like, why burn down a business that serves your own neighborhood? Doesn't a prolonged economic boycott, in the tradition of the civil rights movement, doesn't that exert more effective pressure?
Well, on paper, a boycott is the textbook answer, right?
Yeah.
But you have to look at the historical context of St. Louis that Nyota is operating within.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, she argues that the establishment there was incredibly adept at waiting out boycotts. They had this long history of just sweeping local police violence under the rug. So her rationale is pretty stark. She basically says if they relied on a slow, methodical economic boycott, Michael Brown's death would have been a local footnote within a week.
Oh, wow. So the argument is that the local political machine is literally designed to absorb passive resistance without changing at all.
Precisely. I mean, the system can ignore a picket line,
Yeah.
but it cannot ignore a burning building on national television. So she views the destruction of that quick trip not as mindless looting, but as a necessary extreme disruption of revenue and order.
It was a flare shot into the sky.
Exactly. It was a flare. It was the only mechanism available to bypass the local cover-up and force a global audience to look at the entrenched police corruption in their city.
And the flare works, right? The whole world looks at Ferguson. The cameras arrive. But, and this is where the dynamic completely inverts, because according to Nyota, the people who stepped in front of those cameras to speak to the world were not the people who lit the flare.
No, they weren't. They weren't even from the state in some cases.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah, Nyota explicitly names figures like DeRay McKesson, who came down from Minnesota, and organizations like Black Lives Matter. Her claim is that these entities were entirely absent during the initial, really dangerous phase of the protests.
When it was just local people facing tear gas.
Right. She says they only materialized, as she puts it, when the cameras came.
Okay, let's talk about the mechanics of how that actually happens, because it feels a lot like venture capital entering the activist space.
Oh, that's an interesting way to put it.
Yeah, think about it. You have a local startup, these grassroots organizers who have built a very raw, authentic product aimed at local municipal reform. And suddenly, they get global traction.
Right, they go viral.
Right. And then the national organizations swoop in like corporate investors. They look at the local founders and realize, you guys are great, but local St. Louis politics doesn't scale.
Wow, yeah.
So the investors push the original founders out, grab the microphones, and pivot the whole movement into a globally marketable product, which completely changes the identity of the group in the process.
That venture capital analogy is a highly accurate way to frame her critique of the, quote, nonprofit industrial complex. Because just like in the corporate world, the takeover isn't just about stealing the spotlight.
Right.
It requires actually dismantling the existing company culture. So to take control, these incoming groups allegedly had to manufacture divisions within that unified local coalition we talked about earlier.
But how do you do that?
Yeah.
How do you intentionally divide a community that literally just bonded over a shared trauma?
By heavily promoting specific demographics that fit a marketable narrative while actively marginalizing the ones who don't.
Okay, give me an example.
So Nyota claims these outside organizations deliberately drove a wedge between the youth and the elders. They were pushing the slogan that, this isn't your grandfather's civil rights movement.
Wow, just completely dismissing the older generation.
Exactly. And more disturbingly, she details a calculated effort to push straight black men out of leadership roles entirely in favor of a single black mother narrative.
Which, that fundamentally erases the presence of involved fathers in that community.
Yes.
She points out the glaring irony that Michael Brown Jr. was literally named after his father, Michael Brown Sr.
Right.
Yet the media apparatus largely sidelined the father to focus almost exclusively on the image of the solitary grieving mother.
Because it creates a cleaner, more tragic protagonist for a national fundraising campaign?
Exactly. It dictates who is allowed to be the face of their own tragedy. And that had to have real-world consequences for local organizers who didn't fit that new corporate profile.
Oh, it absolutely did.
But wait, I have to challenge the premise a little bit here, that an entire community of hardened local activists just allow themselves to be sidelined.
It sounds hard to believe, right?
Yeah, these are people who are standing their ground against militarized police.
Yeah.
It takes more than just a slick PR pitch to make someone abandon the core mission of their neighborhood. Why didn't the locals just tell the outsiders to pack up and leave?
It's a crucial question, and Nyota points to the psychological vulnerability of the local organizers. Remember, these people were exhausted.
That's true.
They were suffering from severe sleep deprivation, trauma, the constant stress of police standoffs every single night, and then these well-funded, well-rested corporate operatives arrive, promising them institutional power.
So it's essentially an exploitation of fatigue.
Fatigue and ego. Nyota mentions young local activists like Janetta Elzinetta getting swept up in this machinery.
Right.
When you're a young person in the middle of a traumatizing conflict, and suddenly a global media apparatus validates you, tells you that you are the new Malcolm X or Martin Luther King, and offers you a massive platform.
That's intoxicating.
It is incredibly difficult to resist that gravity. The outside organizations didn't just push the locals out, they co-opted the most visible young voices by inflating their egos and separating them from their local roots.
That paints a really grim picture of human nature under pressure. But of course, the promise of a platform usually comes with a promise of funding.
Always.
And where there is venture capital, there is a massive influx of cash, which leads us to the missing millions.
Right. This is the pivot where Nyota's account transitions from a critique of media strategy to a demand for hard financial accountability.
Because the money came pouring in, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. After the national organizations took the reins, millions of dollars in donations flooded in from across the globe.
So let's look at the reality on the ground versus the bank accounts of these organizations.
Yeah.
How much of that global funding does Nyota claim actually reached the Ferguson community?
Zero.
Zero.
She claims absolutely nothing trickled down to the people whose lives were upended by the protests.
And she backs this up with some brutal examples in the interview. She brings up local protesters who literally lost their jobs and homes.
Yeah.
She specifically names Melissa McKenna, who was a local protester facing 17 years in prison, and she was given absolutely no legal defense fund by any of these massive, well-funded national groups.
No. And she also calls out the performative nature of celebrity involvement, which is fascinating.
Oh, like who?
She cites Talib Kweli, raising bail money and taking credit on Twitter, but allegedly dodging the actual Ferguson organizers when they tried to find out where that bail money was actually being deployed.
That is wild. But the most glaring example to me is Michael Brown Sr. himself.
Yeah.
Nyota points out that his own foundation, which is called Chosen for Change, received virtually nothing. Meanwhile, other groups were raising over $1 million in a single day by fundraising off of what would have been his son's 19th birthday.
It's sickening when you look at those numbers.
You look at that disparity and you have to ask, how is this structurally possible? I mean, I understand that scaling up a nonprofit quickly can lead to bureaucratic incompetence, sure, but this sounds deliberate.
Nyota absolutely rejects the idea of mere incompetence. She describes the financial structure as a deliberate, sophisticated shell game.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of this shell game, because it's not just, a guy putting cash in a briefcase. How are they structurally obscuring millions of dollars?
Right. So she explains that massive funding comes in from high net worth white liberal groups. She explicitly names George Soros and the Open Society Foundations.
Okay.
But that money isn't just deposited into a single Ferguson Relief checking account. It's funneled through this labyrinth of sub-organizations and fiscal sponsors.
Right, of course.
So Group A receives the grant, takes a hefty administrative fee, and passes it to Group B, which then sponsors Group C, and so on.
Which provides layers of plausible deniability.
Exactly. But Nyota makes a vital distinction about who's actually doing the deceiving here.
What do you mean?
She says the mega donors at the very top, like Soros, they are not hiding. Their political goals and their funding are relatively transparent if you actually know where to look. The deception happens at the ground level.
Because if you are a grassroots activist, your primary currency is your street credibility.
Exactly.
Like if the local community finds out you're on the payroll of a billionaire's think tank, you lose all your authenticity. So the labyrinth exists to protect the brand of the frontline activist.
That is the whole function of the shell game. The public-facing leaders get to hold the megaphone and basically play dumb about the bank accounts. They claim ignorance about the complex financial routing, all while quietly doing the bidding of the organizations controlling the purse strings.
And what is that bidding? Because this is where the structural funding ties directly into the political sabotage that Nyota describes.
Right.
When you follow the money, you start to understand why the narrative of the movement was shifted so aggressively.
And this is where Nyota levels an intense critique at the Democratic Party, which you have to understand is really shocking to a mainstream audience, given that the Democratic Party typically positions itself as the institutional ally of civil rights.
Yeah, she tears that assumption apart by pointing at the raw facts of the Missouri political machine.
She reminds the audience that the establishment they were fighting in 2014 was predominantly Democratic.
Right.
It was a Democratic governor, Jay Nixon, who deployed militarized National Guard tanks against the citizens of Ferguson.
Why?
And it was a Democratic prosecutor, Bob McCulloch, who she alleges deliberately engineered the grand jury proceedings to guarantee that Officer Darren Wilson would never face a trial.
So when you realize the local enemy is the Democratic machine, the involvement of national left-leaning political operatives becomes highly suspect.
Extremely suspect.
Like, why would national Democratic donors fund a movement aimed at tearing down local Democratic politicians?
According to Nyota, they wouldn't. And that is exactly why they hijacked it.
Oh, I see.
Her theory is that the national funding was essentially a containment strategy. You flood the zone with money, You buy out the visible leadership, and then you shift the focus of the movement entirely away from actionable local political reform.
You export the activism.
Exactly.
That completely explains the detail in the interview that originally seemed so bizarre to me. Yoda talks about how the movement's focus suddenly pivoted to the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Right, which seems totally out of left field.
Yeah. If you were trying to stop local police from shooting people in St. Louis, organizing solidarity tours to the Middle East makes zero tactical sense, unless the goal is distraction.
It is a calculated diversion. By redirecting the energy of the movement toward global, intractable geopolitical conflicts, you ensure that the local political machine in Missouri is never actually threatened.
The local politicians get to keep their jobs. The national nonprofits get to keep raising money on global issues. And the people of St. Louis are left exactly where they started.
Neotis summarizes the result bluntly. She says it ensures that the local Black community remains a permanent, manageable underclass.
Wow.
Their pain is monetized globally, while the systemic issues in their own backyards remain completely untouched.
And demanding transparency on a grift of this scale is incredibly dangerous. Which brings us back to the stark reality we opened with.
Yeah.
The cost of speaking out for Nyota wasn't just, being unpopular on Twitter.
Yeah.
It was physical and terrifying.
The retaliation was severe. When she started asking for the accounting books, when she started pointing out that the local movement had been co-opted, her life was threatened.
Right.
As you mentioned earlier, her home was broken into. And she is resolute in her claim that these intimidation tactics were orchestrated by forces within the movement itself, going all the way up to the national levels of Black Lives Matter.
It is a horrifying inversion. The people claiming to dedicate their lives to protecting Black bodies were allegedly terrorizing a Black woman because she threatened their funding model.
It is. And we must talk about the ultimate consequence of this internal conflict, which centers around a man named Darren Seals.
Yes, absolutely. Darren Seals is a crucial figure in this story. He was a local straight Black man in Ferguson, an original organizer, and he was fiercely allied with Nyota in exposing what they saw as the hijacking of their city.
He was one of the loudest critics of the new activist leadership.
Yeah, he refused to be marginalized by that new narrative. He actively spoke out about the missing funds and the political co-opting of the movement alongside Nyota.
And the timeline of what happens next is just chilling.
It really is.
Just 1 week after the specific African Diaspora News Channel interview with Nyota aired an interview where they laid all these allegations out on the table, Darren Seals was found dead.
Unbelievable.
He was shot, and his body was left inside a burning car in St. Louis.
It is a devastating reality check on the stakes of this conversation.
Yeah.
Because, while we are sitting here analyzing political theory and nonprofit financial structures, the people living this reality are facing ultimate consequences.
We are talking about literal life and death.
Yeah.
The murder of Darren Seals remains unsolved, but for Nyota and the remaining local organizers, it operates as a grim confirmation of the immense danger they are in for challenging the apparatus.
It forces us to acknowledge that the machinery of a multi-million-dollar political movement will aggressively defend itself.
Yes.
And sometimes, allegedly utilizing the very same oppressive tactics it publicly claims to be dismantling.
It is a lot to process. I mean, we started with an organic, unified community mourning a tragedy, and we ended with unsolved murders, international money laundering through philanthropy, and the complete institutional capture of a grassroots outcry.
It requires all of us to apply a much more rigorous level of critical thinking to the information we consume. And that is why this deep dive is so vital for you, the listener. It doesn't matter if you have never set foot in St. Louis, or if you consider yourself completely apolitical.
Right, because it affects everyone.
Because you live in a digital ecosystem where your attention and your empathy are constantly being monetized. When you see a hashtag trending, when you're prompted to donate $5 to a GoFundMe for a viral cause, you have to pause and ask the difficult questions.
You have to ask, who built this platform? Who is actually controlling the bank account? And most importantly, what are the local voices on the ground saying when the national cameras aren't rolling?
Exactly. This source material is a profound warning that the broadcast narrative is almost never the whole truth. It really challenges us to look past the slick corporate branding of modern activism.
It reveals the deep paradox of trying to enact change in the digital age.
It really does. Which leaves me with a lingering thought that I want you to carry with you today. If every organic local movement that achieves enough visibility to actually change things inevitably attracts the venture capital of the nonprofit industrial complex.
Yeah.
Is it even structurally possible to have a purely grassroots uprising anymore? Or is every genuine cry for justice destined to be swallowed, repackaged, and utilized by the very establishment it set out to defeat? Keep digging and keep questioning the narrative.